part of Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2022. It is a collaboration between Law Society, Pro Bono Services, the 5 Community Development Councils, National University, Singapore Faculty of Law, Singapore University of Social Sciences, School of Law, Singapore Management University School of Law, and the Singapore Corporate Counsel Association Pro Bono Chapter, supported by the People's Association. I'm Yos Pang, and I am your host for this webinar today. Today's webinar is Be Cybersecured. In case you didn't know, there are some first housekeeping matters. Today we will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A sessions. You can also submit your questions at any point during the webinar and also upvote on any questions that interest you. If you have a smartphone or tablet with you, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at into the address bar. Next, key in our event passcode, which is passcode as shown in the slide. Alternatively, you can click on the link shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole on your device. If you're viewing this webinar on your desktop or laptop, you should receive an invitation to launch Pigeonhole. Please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar, Genie Gan and Jeffrey Lim. Genie Gan, she's actually joining us for the webinar from Abu Dhabi, and actually she heads up Kaspeki's public affairs in the Asia Pacific and Middle East, Turkey, and Africa regions, where she's responsible for developing trusted relations with government and institutional stakeholders for the company, while integrating the business communications and public policy strategies. She frequently speaks on international platforms and is a thought leader on topics surrounding public policy and the intersection of technology and policy. She holds a JD, an honors degree in accountancy, and a specialist diploma in counseling psychology. Called to the Singapore Bar, she's also mediation coach at the Singapore Mediation Center and a mediator at the Singapore International Mediation Institute. Genie started her journeys in accountancy and law in Big Four firms. Early on, she founded a successful startup in the service industry before spending a significant time in public service as a government official, taking on various portfolios such as Special Assistant to Minister of Law and Singapore Delegate to the UN General Assembly and Director at the Law Society. Outside her portfolio, her passion for teaching, nonprofit, and charity work has led her to be an adjunct lecturer at universities and serve on various boards and committees of nonprofit organizations and volunteer for pro bono legal causes. Our next speaker, Jeffrey Lim, who is with me today. Jeffrey is a lawyer specializing in data governance, cybersecurity, privacy, and artificial intelligence. His clients include global e-commerce multinationals and technology companies. He was in-house counsel at a global technology company where he managed the data privacy compliance program for East Asia, ANC, and India. Jeffrey has worked with many organizations in implementing legal frameworks and policy in addressing data protection and cybersecurity compliance programs in many sectors, ranging from healthcare, financial institutions, e-commerce, and tech. He has also conducted workshops and seminars on dealing with data breaches, data transfers, and compliance. Jeffrey is the chair of the Law Society's Cybersecurity and Data Protection Committee and legal advisor to the Singapore Computer Society. He has written articles on data protection published by the PDPC and is the lead writer for the legal chapter in the NCS INTA AI Ethics Body of Knowledge. He is a former chair of the Law Society's Project Law, Health, and remains active in pro bono work. Genie Gan and Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, we are going to start with Genie giving an overview of how our personal data and financial data are at risk in light of the current cybersecurity trends. And then Jeffrey will be sharing more about where privacy notice contains, trends in managing privacy notices, and the role of PDPC and AGC plays and the distinguishing differences between the PDPA issues and the CMA issues. With that, let's have Genie go through. Thank you, Genie.
Thank you, Yos. And good day to everyone. I believe it's afternoon, if not, it's evening in Singapore. So yes, good day to you from the Middle East, currently here on a business trip. I'll be going through some slides in my presentation, and please reserve any questions that you have and type them into Pigeonhole if you so wish to get clarifications. Now, to start us off, really, I think it is an understatement to say that we've gone through an evolution of the digital age, from the Egyptian steel carvings back in 2000 BC to printing press invention in 1440, all the way to, just moving on to the next era already. My slides need to advance. Yeah, all the way to the first print ad on a book in England in 1472, to our first electric sign lit in New York Times Square in the 1800s. And moving on to the golden age of advertising in the 1900s, from black and white to colored TV as well, and on radio. And also next to the rise of where we are today in digital marketing with the advent of Internet of Things, ruled by the internet and pretty much to a large extent by social media as well. Now, next, there is, I know this has been probably touched on too many times over and over again, but there is a pandemic effect also when it comes to cyber risks that's facing each and every one of us. During COVID, and amplifying the effects of digitalization and the risks that digitalization actually has posed to us, I've put out some of the key statistics based on my company's research. In 2020, Kaspersky actually have found and detected more than 5 million malicious installation packages, and more than 100,000 new mobile banking trojans, which never existed before COVID. And of course, more than 20,000 new mobile ransomware trojans. We'll talk a little bit more about ransomware later, but basically ransomware, if you're not familiar, are activities which would sort of hack into your system, and then in layman terms, they would ask you for money before releasing control back to you of your computer or your device, and extort you for money. And upon payment of the money, you may, or in most cases, may not actually recover your data or not be able to regain access to your device. Yeah, and within Southeast Asia, 6 in 10 users are now shopping online, obviously because of the lockdown situation that's faced most of the countries, not just within Southeast Asia, but also globally. And 42% of users in Southeast Asia are actually afraid about someone accessing their financial details through their devices. I suppose that to a large extent is because most people would sometimes store their financial information in their devices so as to facilitate easy shopping online during COVID. Now, if you were to look at this chart in front of you, it's interesting. And it actually tracks the number of attacks on mobile users in 2019 and 2020. So that sort of is the timeline leading us into the pandemic in the early part of 2020 or the late part of 2019. I think it is, again, an understatement to say that the pandemic has affected every aspect of our lives. And of course, the landscape of mobile threats has been no exception. Still on that slide, sorry. We saw a decrease in the number of attacks in the first half of 2020, which can be attributed to the confusion of the first months of the pandemic. I suppose the attackers had other things to worry about themselves at that point in time. They were back at it in the second half of the year though. And we therefore, if you see the chart, we saw an increase in attacks involving mobile bankers as well. And besides that, we saw stronger interest in banking data, both from criminal groups specializing in mass infections, as well as from those who prefer to select their targets carefully when it comes to targeted attacks. And this too was affected by the pandemic. The inability to visit a bank branch, your nearest DBS or OCBC or any other branch actually forced customers to switch to mobile and online banking, and banks to consider stepping up the development of those services to moving on to mobile for the sake of the customers. Now in Singapore, attacks via browsers are the primary method for spreading malicious programs. So on the next slide, you actually would see some key statistics. It's online threats alone in 2021, we saw a whopping close to 7 million different internet-borne cyber threats that were detected by our products on computers, right? Just within Singapore alone, and that is a lot, right? And some of the methods that were used most often by cyber criminals to penetrate systems includes exploiting vulnerabilities in browsers and their plugins, which is used by the majority of attacks. Infection in this type of attack takes place when visiting an infected website without any intervention from the user. Just by visiting the website, you get hit by it, right? And oftentimes without your knowledge as well. The second most frequently deployed method is social engineering, right? Obviously, these attacks require your participation as a user. You have to download a malicious file unknowingly onto your computer. And oftentimes you would believe that you're downloading a legitimate program or an app, but in fact, maybe it's a malicious file. On the next slide, you would see some other statistics which are relatively interesting as well. Local infection statistics. Basically, local threats, or what we call local infection statistics, where the infection actually takes place in the hardware device, your computer or your mobile phone, so on and so forth. And the numbers are also rather alarming. You would see that's closer to 4 million than 3 million of local incidents that were detected in Singapore alone. And the use of local infection statistics for user computers is an extremely important indicator, because like worms and file viruses account for the majority of such incidents. And this data actually shows how frequently users are attacked by malware spread via removable USB drives, CDs, and in some instances, DVDs, and other offline methods. Protection against such attacks not only requires an antivirus solution capable of treating infected, that's really the baseline, but there are some other tools that people usually have learned to deploy as well to be able to counter these. In the next slide, again, a little bit more statistics just to end off this segment. Our threat landscape in Singapore in 2021 is as such, and you would see that phishing attempts features quite heavily in our threat landscape in 2021. We will talk a little bit more about phishing later on. Also brute force attacks against RDPs, and also malicious installation packages on mobile devices. And also there were 53, just in 2021 alone, 53 new mobile banking trojans that were monitored by us. In the next slide, I would go on to define the problem for you very quickly. First of all, you would notice, if you can move on to the next slide. First of all, you would notice that in the recent times, people start talking about the increasing importance of cybersecurity. And really, maybe before the pandemic, or even the last 5 or 10 years ago, people never really talked about cybersecurity that much. And all that they ever knew about was an antivirus software installed into your computer. Right? But I suppose with digitalization, with the pandemic accelerating the risks that are facing people through the digitalization, there are more and more of us that rely on technology for daily activities, and cyber criminals now have more opportunities to find weaknesses in our systems, in our computers, in our devices, in us, right, to conduct malicious activities. And of course, password theft is on a steep rise, and I've just put down some samples of relatively recent news in the local news on some of these incidents happening in Singapore. And also this causes us to talk a little bit more and think a little bit more about the need to secure our devices, and the data has become more and more critical. Next. Why? So we're trying to define the problem. So we ask the question, why be concerned with malware? In short, really malware is a malicious software that would facilitate cyber criminals stealing of your data, corrupting your data, and or even in some instances deleting your data, right? And so if the data is valuable to you, especially if it's financial data, for instance, that's very personal, very private to you, and very valuable to you because it basically opens up access to your finances and your assets, that is something definitely to be concerned about. Next. And there also is an increasing prevalence of mobile malware, which I should draw your attention to. Basically, almost any personal data that's stored in our smartphones can be monetized. Agree? Yeah. And in particular, advertisers can display targeted offerings, and attackers can access accounts with various services such as online banking. So it is no wonder that our data on our mobile devices is very much coveted, and such theft of information can actually take place through the following methods, which you see on this slide: mobile banking malware, mobile ransomware, which basically locks you off your device and steals your data and blackmail you for money, mobile spyware that can track you, and mobile adware that is the reason behind the annoying pop-ups on your phone, and they can actually steal your information in your process as well, including your financial information like your credit card details. Next. Now, let's try and understand the malware a little bit more, understand the word malware a little bit more. Basically, devices may be infected through these methods that you see in this slide, by clicking on suspicious links. So do be very careful. Downloading of apps. Again, be very sure about the source before doing so, and check. Sometimes using non-secure open Wi-Fi or websites can be extremely dangerous also. And using a device that's not updated with the latest security fixes or patches is also very, it's also something to take note of. Next. There are some attitudes towards cybersecurity that we found out through a survey that we conducted last year. I thought I'll just put out a couple of key ones here. Basically, about one in every 2 Singaporean respondents check and change their privacy settings in their devices and apps. If you ask me, this is not enough. We actually need every person to be checking and changing their privacy settings regularly. 67% reported protecting all their devices with passwords. This is not enough. It's actually quite worrying because we should in fact be protecting our devices with passwords all the time. 48%, which is again about 1 in 2, protect your devices with internet security software. Definitely not enough, because it also means that the other 1 in every 2 are not protected. Next. Now, I thought I'll just share with you what is the #1 topmost infection, or rather the most popular infection vector that's affecting the world today. And it basically is phishing. Not sure how many of you understand phishing, but the most common modus operandi of phishing would be, to disguise themselves as an individual or a reputable organization in the form of email, WhatsApp message, SMS, or any other communication channel. And this is basically, the motive of all of that is to fraudulently obtain your personal and your financial information, like your login passwords, bank account numbers, credit card numbers, so on and so forth. Such information that can be exploited for their profit. And once they obtain that personal information, they could then gain access to all your accounts and impersonate you and extract money and extract other valuable assets, right? Or to even scam your contacts. So I think this is something that you must have seen on TV, in TV shows, and in some dramas of late where they tell such stories. These are true stories, by the way. Next. I have on the next slide some examples of phishing. And if you're able to take a closer look at the slide, you actually would see that I have circled out in red some of these links that are included in either the emails or WhatsApp messages or SMSs. These are there are telltale signs to phishing attempts. So you can actually, if you look closer and before clicking on any link, to just take a closer look at what might be illegitimate. Sometimes also some of these messages or emails are full of spelling mistakes and are very badly worded and doesn't really sound like it's a legit source, even if it's your Grab or your telco subscription, well, allegedly emails from these legit sources. But do take a closer look as well. In the next slide, I have further examples. And these are from, again, reputable names. We're talking about Singpost, DHL. During COVID, people were relying a lot on these services. And we had seen an increasing number of phishing attempts through such logistic companies, and really just passing off as Singpost, for instance. And again, I have circled out the telltale signs in red. And if you were to take a closer look, that actually, if you are discerning enough, you can actually easily spot them yourselves. Next. Also, during COVID, there were actually vaccine-related phishing. So obviously, COVID-19 vaccinations was one of the hottest global topics, right, during COVID, and therefore it's extremely highly attractive to scammers. Cyber criminals are basically opportunistic, right? So they took advantage of people's desire to get vaccinated as quickly as possible. In the UK, not Singapore, but in the UK, for instance, some UK residents received an email that appeared to come from the country's National Health Service. And in that email, the recipient was invited to be vaccinated, of course, having first confirmed their participation in the program by clicking on the link. And then in another email, the attackers focused on age. People over 65 were asked to contact a clinic to receive a vaccination. So in both cases, to make a vaccination appointment, a form had to be filled out with personal data. And in the first case, the phishers, PHISHERS, also wanted bank card details. If the victim followed all the instructions on the fake website, they would have handed the money on a silver platter and their personal data to the attackers. Another way to gain access to users' personal data and purse strings was through fake vaccination surveys. So scammers also sent out emails in the name of large pharmaceutical companies providing COVID-19 vaccines, and the message invited recipients to take part in a short survey, but actually in the process, you've just given away your personal information. Now, next, which is related to banking, related phishing. Basically, these are some samples. Calls or messages impersonating as a financial institution, claiming issues with your device, bank accounts. This, by the way, is not something that happened only during COVID. Literally, yesterday, while in the Middle East, I received on my Singapore phone number one such message from apparently one of the local banks. So obviously, they would usually ask for your personal particulars, internet banking details, and OTPs. So do be very mindful. Finally, on the next slide, you would see some business-themed phishing, right? So basically, corporate usernames, passwords are extremely coveted for scammers to counter people's increasingly wary attitude to emails from outside. Attackers actually try to give their emails a respectable look, right? Disguising themselves as messages from business tools, which you can see on the screen, like Microsoft, and by blending into your workflow and your workspace, the scammers actually have learned to calculate that the user will be persuaded to follow the link and enter data on a fake page. So do be very mindful. And next. I thought I'll just put out some key statistics also about the latest state of phishing in Southeast Asia. 11 million alone in 2021 across Southeast Asia. And Singapore being a small country, you see about 500,000. It doesn't look too bad compared to the other countries, but you know, this is, well, these numbers obviously would vary according to the population size. So please do not think that Singapore is fine and safe, just, you know, we're all good. I think we still do have a lot more work to do. In the next slide. Yes, let's talk about solutions, and I'll quickly wrap up my segment in the next slide. Really always say that whether it's COVID, a sickness, or anything, you know, when it comes to cyber health, prevention is always better than cure. And this is something that I like to go out there and say, not just for, you know, your physical health, but also for your online health, because you're actually losing your most prized possessions, especially when you're losing your financial information. So do be mindful of of the ways that you should, of the steps you need to take to prevent a cyber attack on you. So in the following slides, I'll be sharing just a little bit, and then I'll wrap up. First of all, what are you protecting? I've mentioned this: your assets, your intellectual property, your personal data, your financial information. And if you are an organization or you run a business, however small, basically your reputation is on the line, because if your data is compromised or it's been leaked out, basically your customers' data, your clients or your users are affected. And there goes your entire PR attempts to maintain a good reputation, because overnight, literally, that's just wiped out from under your feet. And obviously your company's systems and databases are also at risk. Next. So it is as baseline, it's important to have a robust antivirus software. I've put out on the slide some of the factors that you should be considering in choosing one that is suited for you. Yeah. Check whether, because different softwares have different features. Yeah. So these are some of the baseline things that you must make sure that, you know, these boxes are checked. Make sure there are automatic updates and scanning. Make sure that there are malware removal capabilities as well. It's of course user-friendly, and it must be cost-friendly. And always read the user review so that you can make a more calculated decision. Next. Now, what else to look out for? You would also, please focus your attention on the right block. Basically, you must also make sure that these antivirus softwares must have anti-phishing features, which should also provide data backup and privacy advisories, and also should provide you the option of safe browsing mode and remote lock. Next. VPN is something that we use a lot more these days than before COVID, and I've noticed a trend in users paying more attention to VPN and using it actually. So with VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network, data traveling to and from your device is encrypted. So that gives an added layer of security, and it makes it hard for cyber criminals to eavesdrop into your ongoing activities and to keep your data safe. Right. So also to keep your browsing sessions private, when you use free Wi-Fi network, for example, in your nearest Starbucks, for example, you know, you're just working remotely, you should actually be using a VPN device in the process of using that free public Wi-Fi. Next. Now, some very basic tips. I know, but it does bear repeating. You must have heard it before. 2FA, two-factor authentication. Basically, it's about, I like to use this analogy, lock your door twice or more, right? So don't just lock your phone. It'll be best if you can also lock your SIM card. So basically 2FA is something that we do, you know, when we try to log into, you know, like SingPass website or anything. Usually there is also the login password, and then you'll be asked for an OTP. So that actually is a layman's most common example of what's 2FA. So we should respect such new protocols to be able to keep our own data safe. Next. And I think we are onto passwords still. So how do we do it right? Making sure that your password is as complex as possible, containing uppercase, lowercase characters, numbers, basically keep it alphanumeric with symbols if possible. And if it's allowed in whatever website that you're trying to log into, please never use personal information that's easy to find, like your date of birth, purely numbers, right? Or popular words and character combinations such as password, right? Password is a very horrible password. Please don't use password as your password. And if you like, there are actually tools such as, password generators that you can use to help you generate a strong password automatically and be able to store them in a secure vault. Next, these are some examples of how we can do it based on nasi lemak rules. Yeah, so you can, I'm not going to repeat all of them. It's a bit difficult to do so. So you can actually create your own password creation convention according to a root word or root phrase, nasi lemak rules, by creating these other different variations. And you can go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Basically, by when you try to change your password regularly every 3 or 6 months or however number of months. Yeah. Next. Some basic tips, and I think I'm approaching the end already. Basically, keep your privacy settings on at all times, especially on social media, please. And download apps only from verified legitimate sources. Be careful about the information you share online with anyone. Be vigilant about who you meet and speak to virtually, and secure your devices with robust security solutions, which I've given you some examples of. Next. I have a sample of what I personally encountered. So this was a message that I got from my friends on Facebook quite recently, where she actually asked me for my mobile number. I was being cheeky. So actually the right way to do this is just to ignore, but I was cheeky and I actually responded and said, oh, but you already have it. And I took a screenshot, which is exactly this. And I WhatsApped her and said that, hey, I think your account just got hacked into it. And she checked and she's like, yeah, no kidding. I got locked up from my Facebook account. So so there are actually telltale signs. So if this person is truly a friend and already has contact number, should not be asking you for that. Yeah. So just be vigilant and be careful in your daily life. Yeah. And in the next slide, these are just some tips which are obvious to some, but not so for others. Please try to pay with a credit card instead of a debit card. Right. This surprises some people, but it is far easier to hack into a credit card or to compromise a credit card than it is with a debit card. Yeah, and always enable 2FA for all transactions. Never store your credit card information online, please. I know it's tiring to key in your credit card number with every transaction, but trust me, you only need one bad incident and you will forever regret having stored your credit card information online. Okay, so be wary also of offers that are too good to be true. Make sure you disable the browser's autocomplete feature and avoid doing financial transactions over unsecured Wi-Fi, and be vigilant against phishing sites. And I think with that, I'm just going to touch on just one slide on what you should do as an organization, just in case some of you actually are listening into this webinar, not just for yourself, but also for organizations, businesses, whatsoever. Just be mindful to defend your perimeter and run cybersecurity drills. It's actually very important that there are actually mock exercises that you run to test how robust your system is. Verify your supply chain software and monitor the latest trends and attacks. Always keep yourself up to date with the latest news of what's happening and take the preventive measures necessary. I've given you some basic one-on-one pointers today. I hope they've been useful. And also, if you have got staff, people in your company, do motivate them to report suspicious things. Don't just close the window and pretend it's not there, in case another colleague actually faces the same problem and falls and walks right into the trap. And of course, also always encourage staff to be responsible individuals, because when humans are generally the weakest link. So if any one person's computer or device is compromised, the entire organization is compromised. Yeah. Okay, right. Thank you. So I think that is the end of my presentation. I will hand the time back to Yos.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. We actually have a couple of really interesting questions, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to ask, just because it's fresh in your mind. Thank you for sharing the cybersecurity trends as well as the practices. The first question is in relation to cloud storage. The participants have asked if cloud storage can be hacked to access personal data, files, and information, and whether cloud storage is actually safe.
That's quite a technical question, actually. I'm not sure if I'm in the best position to advise that, but there have been mixed opinions in the industry. And I know everything is moving on to the cloud. How safe the cloud is really depends on the cloud provider and how robust their cybersecurity, their cloud security systems are. So I can't say as a blanket, like which, and it's also not right for me to tell you which one is more safe and which one is not. And I may not be privy to what kind of cybersecurity solutions or systems they're using to secure the cloud. So it really depends. But I would always say that as a baseline, just take it that nothing is completely safe. Yeah. That's really the best, rule of thumb.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeannie. Thank you. I guess the second and the last question is about scammers. So the question that the participant had asked is, how do these scammers obtain our legitimate email addresses, accounts, and phone numbers? I know you shared phishing and malware and all these, but I thought it might be a good way to sort of recap and perhaps also have some.
Yeah, unfortunately, thanks for that question. Unfortunately, there are, and I know this for a fact, because my personal information apparently landed in the wrong hands once before. And upon investigation, we found out that my legit information were actually, or like my contact details or email address and contact number actually were obtained through a database that was sold to this particular country, this particular company, or this particular actor. And I was really cheesed off. So I think there are syndicates out there that are collecting information. It can be anything, through a lucky draw slip that you filled out, or an email that, for instance, like we publicize our email addresses or contact details sometimes on social media platforms, or even on LinkedIn, so on and so forth. So just be very mindful, because at first instance, you may have given out your legit information to a legitimate source, but somehow, and this is what ICT supply chain is all about, right? So beyond that first instance, you never know if that particular recipient of the information had their systems compromised, for instance. And then actually scammers or hackers actually compromise, or rather exploit that information and compromise it, or sell it off to a third party who then perhaps is a scamming syndicate. So there can be many change of hands to eventually land in the wrong hands. So what I'll say is just be very careful. So ever since the incident, I have stopped participating in any lucky draws, for instance, among the many other things, among the many other preventive measures that I've taken.
Thank you, Jeannie. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking. I should also be more mindful about lucky draws in the future. So I guess it's a good segue for me to introduce Jeffrey and to also have him to talk about privacy and to go in depth. We have quite a number of questions, but I think we're going to park that, and Jeffrey it might be also answered in Jeffrey's slides as well. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you, Yos.
Thank you, Yos. Thank you.
Okay, so Genie's done a great job in getting us started and giving us a lot of information on cybersecurity tips and trends. Let's where we might be looking at all these things. One of the related areas to cybersecurity is how the law has sort of worked in building out a framework for legal redress and support for the protection of your personal data. And that's really the field of privacy law, data protection law. So what I'm going to do is to cover a few points. And the first 3 points I'm going to cover really is to talk about privacy notices and really what they are and what they contain. And then I'm going to talk about who you can turn to or who gets involved if something goes wrong and there's a PDPA issue or a cybersecurity issue. And different people or different organizations and regulatory bodies might get involved if there is an incident and you have to look for help. And of course, there may be some of you who are in the audience who also run organizations, run businesses. You may in fact run not-for-profit organizations as well. So what you need to do or know when it comes to these issues. So let's start first with privacy notices. And privacy notices, you have on screen now. The first thing, we value your privacy. And I think Genie did mention in one of the slides you did show that just barely half of us really go into privacy settings and address all the settings in our apps. And unfortunately, I think the number is a lot lower when it comes to who actually reads privacy notices. And in fact, this is a cheeky notice you see on screen, because the statement says, yes, we value your privacy, and it goes on to say all these things, and then it gives you options, more options. And the other one that we probably usually click is, yes, I agree, or in this case, whatever, right? So very common, and the reason why it's there is it really just points out the fact that most of us don't have time or inclination to go through privacy notices in all the gory detail. But you know what? The details actually matter. So we have to first ask ourselves, what's in the privacy notice and what are you consenting to? Because when you actually say yes, you'll get through a lot of details that you might want to pick up with this class. So let's start. Most privacy notices will set out and explain a couple of things. What personal data they collect, what they use, and what they disclose. And that's important because that tells you really what you're doing on the app, what you're doing on the site, what information is actually being taken from you or collected from you, often for legitimate purposes, but clearly for purposes that you need to know, right? And then they should tell you a little bit about how they collect your personal data. So what is the interactions that will generate personal data that you collect? How are they getting it from you, in what ways? And as technology progresses, the different ways in which apps and organizations monitor you and collect your data is increasing with sophistication. So knowing that is very helpful. And then why they do so. Very importantly, you need to know why they will collect your data, for what purposes they will disclose it or use it. And again, with the way businesses are developing at that pace with technology, data has become a very strategic and valuable asset. And so when they collect the data from you, there'll be a host of other purposes that they could perhaps apply that data to. And it's good to know what those purposes are. And then to think about who they might disclose your data to. Because you'd be consenting to be saying yes, whatever, to sending that data to someone else. And just knowing the type of organizations or third parties who might receive the data is fundamentally important for all of us as consumers. Then if you think about it, really, there are also options that you can take. And often the privacy notice should tell you how you can exercise those options. Just to think about some of the options you actually have, it's good to know that under data privacy laws, data protection laws, you have the right to get access to your data, to know what data an organization has on you, to also correct any erroneous data that they might have with you, and if you're working on erroneous data, you can get them to correct that. Often you can also withdraw consent. So if you've consented to certain purposes and you find that actually I didn't mean to do so, or I think I'm not trusting the organization so much, or I just want to focus on my use of my data in certain ways, you have the option to withdraw consent and let the organization know, and you should give the organization notice that they should be adjusting the way they deal with your data. And then in some countries, in Singapore soon, there will be rights in relation to portability, which is the right for you to transfer their data or copy your data, certain types of data, to another organization. So if you're planning to do onboard another service provider, or you want to get used to another app, and you think that there's some value in transferring the data that you experience in other apps, this is a good and useful way to do so. So it's quite valuable for us as a matter of convenience. And if you think about it, another thing that's important in the privacy notice is how to lodge a complaint or to place a query, because really the number of things that go over your data might not be something you can cover completely. And so you might have some questions that you want to ask, and who do you reach out to, and who do you contact? And usually there should be contact details, emails or numbers. So what are the purposes for which we might collect user disclosed data? Well, the privacy notices do tell us a clue. The most common and uncontroversial purposes are really the fact that they use the data to provide you with your services. So you're on the app, you're engaging the organization, you want to get things done, you have transactions, and yes, they do need that data to help facilitate that for you. And I don't think that's controversial. And of course, they do supply the content, they service your needs, and that's all well and good. Then we move down a little bit, and we know that some organizations are also wanting to get to know you better. And there's a good side and a bad side in one sense. And the good side is getting to know you better helps them focus what their services for you, how to improve their services for you. There's a potential downside to it where sometimes they know a little bit too much, and they begin to track you, monitor you, and just being aware that sometimes the things that you do in relation to an organization, that information stays with them for quite a while. And then you think about the next point, which is getting value out of the data. Organizations, again, are mining value, taking a lot of insight from you and improving their services. So it's a good thing in some sense, but at the end of the day, sometimes there are some practices that could be questionable, where they might sell your data, where they might be doing some cross-selling, and you might be the target of unwanted approaches by other organizations. And you find that they're anticipating you. So there's the creepiness factor, right? Because you look into apps, and perhaps you're surfing a particular ad is leading to see customized content on your app. And how did they pick that up? Really through the fact that they're monitoring you on your devices. In fact, there's a field of growing awareness that data is valuable, and organizations do look to monetize your data. And there is a saying I put at the bottom there that often you get a lot of apps which are free, right? Or services which are free, but if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Right? And that's because they got to know you and they make the most of the information you know about you. Now, there are some trends, and hope these are good trends in some sense. Legally, we used to be that we've been more obsessed about making sure the organizations follow procedures, they keep transparency, choices, and accountability, and they were agnostic about whether they should interfere. The law has been very sort of permissive in that sense. But increasingly, with the way businesses have been developing use of data, there have been good practices, there have been bad practices, and the law has been trying to sort of lift standards in all communities. And to some extent, they're starting to worry about what's more acceptable, what's not acceptable. So the good news is you are getting laws that are targeting certain behaviors. Bills are being looked at where they're hoping to target things like dark patterns. If you're wondering what a dark pattern is, it's basically manipulated practices to get you to give over your data, right? So sometimes it's a bit of pressure tactics, sometimes it's misinformation, and you are sort of led into giving more information than you ordinarily would have. And so there's a little bit of talk now in some of the legislation that's being debated around the world, talking about these issues. And then as businesses get larger and more effective with their data, sometimes they build a certain type of market power, and they are able to influence and engage with consumers in such a way that is to deprive consumers of opportunities to work up to engage other organizations. So it's anti-competitive, and that too is an area where data privacy laws are heading towards more of an overlap with competition law. And then I think if you've been on any website or social media, you might notice that if you look at certain content and you're, let's say, focused on certain political viewpoints, you'll find that the content that somehow gets generated for you or curated for you seems to reinforce that, and you'll get into what we call an echo chamber. And that has had some negative effects because it has somewhat degraded the quality of public debate in our lives. And that's also an area where the law is looking to build in some safeguards. And this information is a key piece of that. We've had the POFMA Act, which is the Prevention of Online Falsehoods, which is a piece of legislation that Singapore put out in order to address this real problem of targeted disinformation and the spreading of potentially damaging information socially. And so if you think about that, these are all new laws that are being debated or passed, and they're kind of developing alongside privacy laws and data protection laws. And that's a good thing for all of us, I believe, because we do get the benefit of that. Now, data privacy law as well in Singapore as well has actually had a bit of an upgrade. And in fact, it's sort of doubled down on building more responsibility in organizations for data breaches. So if you look at data breaches, the PDPA was recently amended last year. And what it did was it put in place mandatory reporting to the PDPC, the Personal Data Protection Commission. So if you're entrusting your data to an organization and a data breach happens, there's now no room for debate if the scale of the breach or the severity in terms of the sensitivity of the data that's been breached reaches a certain threshold. Organizations have to report this data. And in fact, they have to follow and apply sort of a framework in addressing it. And you can see this framework on the screen. It's basically summarized by the acronym CDC, which is contain the breach, assess the breach to see how severe it is, report it if it reaches the severity levels that require reporting, and to evaluate the breach. How did it happen and how can we do better? And so these are very common sense, basic frameworks, which have now made their way into a very real concrete form in our legislation. And that's a good thing for all of us as consumers. Now, reporting of data breaches, it's important to recognize that if it's a minor breach, not all breaches have to be reported. And that is measured against how many records or individuals have been affected, and also the type of data that's been breached. But assuming you reach that threshold, actually organizations are under a strict timing to try and report that breach within 3 days of making that assessment. So that's quick. And if you think about it, this opens the door to encouraging organizations as well as individuals in remediating the breach to try and do their best to salvage that situation. Now, what happens if something does go wrong, and who do you turn to? And you might have heard of cybersecurity, PDPA. I suppose you should come in no surprise that different organizations and different industries and regulators get involved depending on the breach. Now, this is kind of a crude Venn diagram, which tells you a little bit about how different agencies get involved. Now, we're all aware of the police, right? And we turned it in to protect us. And they have a mandate to look into things like the Computer Misuse Act, which is really about cybersecurity hacking incidents that happen to you. So if your organization is compromised or your personal device has been compromised, do make an effort to file a report or report the incident to the police. That places it with one organization. But you'll notice that it has an overlap as well. So if you find that an organization hasn't done its job in protecting your data properly, or you're worried that organization might have been careless or not fulfilled their obligations to you under the PPA, then you can also launch a report with the PDPC, and they'll handle issues that come under the PPA. So they're not always the same in the sense that sometimes it's not always theft of data, but sometimes it would be an attack that disables your device or rather than encrypt your data. And that would be a bit of separation, but there is often an overlap. For some organizations that you work with, so if it's banks, if it's healthcare, you also have the added benefit as a consumer to know that other organizations, other regulatory bodies are also looking at these issues, and they would also take their turn and working with the other regulatory bodies to do that. So those are good, good things to note. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about what happens if you're an organization and what do you have to do. So if you're an organization or you happen to be working in an organization or you run in your own business, Well, you've got to do some basic minimum things, and I think the PPA has been doing imposing this for quite a while, which is sensible. First, you need to appoint someone who will then take the job of ensuring that compliance is taken seriously and implemented, and that culture of compliance is grown. And that person is usually a data protection officer or DPO, and that then you also sort of have to do the job of mapping the data. What kind of things of data do you collect? How do you collect it? Why do you collect it? And then think about operationalizing these things. So this is a matter of making sure that as a business, as an organization, it just flows down through to everyone. And of course, if there's data breaches, organizations do have to prepare. I think Genie did mention in the earlier slides that there's a certain amount of drills you have to perform. And that's sensible because you can't wait for something bad to happen and then think about what to do. You should be sort of prepared. An example of the type of homework that organizations might do is how they might take stock in the inventory. And, you know, you could look at this as a true map of what happens if they just systematically write down what they data that they collect. It's not perfect, and you can always ask yourselves questions like how this could be better, but at least it's a start. And it's really the type of detail that organizations should be getting into when they're dealing with compliance requirements. And unfortunately, the picture is well, fortunately, unfortunately, the picture is the same whether you are for-profit or not for-profit organization. As you know, the brain falls in both the just and the unjust, right? So there's no special particular status according to not-for-profit organizations. Now they have to do this as well. And if you happen to need help as an organization, do look up the Project Law Help Committee, which is part of the Law Society Pro Bono Services Office. They're supported by volunteer law firms. There are many volunteers there who will be willing to help with legal issues on compliance matters, including PPA and several laws. And that's the contact details you see listed there. So back to you.
Jeffrey. So with that, we will move to the scenarios because the scenarios actually covers quite a lot of the questions that were asked. The first scenario that we are going to talk about today is about online shopping, which is an activity many of us engage in. So just for context, I'm just going to read out the scenario. Ms. Tan is a middle-aged housewife who loves to shop online. She often makes purchases on websites like Shopee, Taobao, Amazon, etc. She has registered her credit card information on these shopping websites, as well as a name, phone number, and address. One day she receives an email from Amazon notifying her that Amazon has recently been a victim of online hacking, and as a result, her data has been breached. This means that her personal data had been leaked, and she's now very worried, and she's not sure what she should do. She's very scared. And I'm just going to weave in one of the question because one of the question also asked, when we purchase items like Ms. Tan herself, all these information has been sort of saved when we buy things. Is this even safe when hackers get hold of this? So I think it might be a good, opportunity for Genie and Jeffrey to share what are the possible actions or next steps that she can take.
Do you want to go first, Genie?
Well, okay. I think that, okay, actually, I think, firstly, I think we should sort of establish the fact that, in Singapore, there were some changes that were made to our 2021 PDP.
Okay, so maybe what I can do is I can address this question by looking at a real life incident and how I helped a particular client deal with his own unfortunate scenario. So we talk about online shopping. In his particular case, it wasn't as benign as just online shopping. It was actually a bit more. He fell into basically a cybersecurity scam where he was given a call by it was a service operator that he had shopped on before, and they called him to tell him that, or they posed as that organization, and they told him that his account details had been compromised and that there was an attack going on at the time. And so, he'd been told that he was now being the victim of an online attack, and they could do something. So he made the mistake of, well, he really should have had his guard up, but in the circumstances, he felt panicky, and he decided that he had to do something. So what he did then was to give control of his device over to a remote operator, who then showed him a screenshot of his I think it was the account page on his user profile. And then actually what was going on was they were actually working behind the scenes, and they collected his data. And I think within the call that he had, which lasted maybe 15, 20 minutes, he then, his data was actually hacked, and account was detail was actually given out, and before he knew it, funds were then transferred from I think the saved bank accounts that he had. So he caught this only because he had two bank accounts on the app. One of them happened to alert him to a transaction that was going on at the time. So he began to realize that something was going on. Now, once that happened, you can sort of say the horse ran out of the gate already, so it's gone out. So what did he do? The first thing he did was to call his bank, and they did put him in touch with certain departments to look after this. But in a situation like that, where you've got monies that get transferred out and things have happened already, the breaches happened, what could he do? And I think what he then did was turn to legal help. I mean, he filed a report with the police, and then he reached out to legal counsel to help, and through referral, and I managed to speak to him. And it turned out that he could get information about initial information from the banks that he worked with as to the location of the transfer of the account. So we know that the money did go to a particular location. In this case, it went to Hong Kong. And so the difficulty with these type of situations is the hackers operate in other jurisdictions. So what they'll do is they'll take the money, they'll put it in an account somewhere that they placed, and then they'll drain the account as soon as they can. So in other words, they're collecting money from various targets, they put it in the account, and at the first opportunity, they will transfer the monies out. In his particular case, he got a little lucky because we acted fast enough to sort of get a notice sent to the banks overseas and to trigger police reporting in Hong Kong itself. And so the notifications reached the bank. I think they did take some action, at least the bank was put on notice. And I think following certain protocols, they also then closed the account. And they realized that they had to pen their investigation. They had to sort of look into the next step. And that's the first thing you should try to do. I mean, if you can get information from your bankers as to where the money's gone to, it gives you a location, a target where you can sort of focus your efforts. But it will never be easy, because when it comes to cross-jurisdiction, cross-border type of issues, we will have to engage foreign counsel, foreign lawyers. We will have to engage the assistance of foreign investigative bodies, law enforcement. And every jurisdiction proceeds at different paces, and there'll be a lot of hoops that you do have to jump through. In his case, he did manage to salvage some of his funds, which is a good thing. But sadly, there are many cases where the money just goes out long before you can get a hold of them through due process and otherwise. So yes, there's a legal remedy you can take, but it is complex and it does have a lot of hoops, and the possibility of you actually securing a remedy is doubtful sometimes, and it will cost you money to get involved. So I think in his case, it was a little bit of good luck that he managed to get something back. Actually, the odds of you getting something back is actually mixed to low. So that's one thing you could do: seek legal help and look to law enforcement agencies to assist you.
Thanks for that, and I'm so sorry that my connection just dropped just now while I was in the middle of trying to give an answer. I think, yeah, I think Jeffrey has given some legal remedy, some pointers there. I must have missed the first part, but presuming that's not been covered, I thought I wanted to just offer some pointers as well. So basically, I think two things, right? Taking a very practical approach. One is to try and stop further damage, and second of all, to prevent this happening again. So first of all, top of mind, Ms. Tan actually should be updating her login credentials. Yeah. In fact, immediately, and not reuse old passwords, and make sure that her security questions are actually refreshed as well and changed regularly to avoid, using the same password across all platforms. That's what we generally do because we're all lazy. I'm definitely guilty of that in the past as well. And of course, secondly, also, in this instance, if her financial information had been breached or leaked, actually, she should immediately contact her bank or her financial institution to inform them about this immediately, so as to prevent, any unknown charges being charged to her account. So a real life example was, we all do online shopping, right? So I actually did some shopping on a particular website that's quite commonly used. And one day, actually, so I just did one purchase. And one day when I was checking my bank statement, I had actually noticed that there were 5 other transactions, albeit of very small amounts. It's like between 10 to 50 Sing dollars each. But some of them actually were, upon investigation, we realized that the charges were made in Vietnam and, other countries. So it could have had been that my financial information was lost while I was traveling, which I do a lot for business. And also, one additional point that I would like to, and I think it bears repeating, is please, when you're doing these online shopping, do not use the autofill function for your passwords, because people normally use autofill to save their passwords and financial credentials in their account or in the computer to save themselves some trouble. But trust me, it may be troublesome to keep repeating the information with every transaction, but it's definitely well worth the effort. And also to use a strong password to avoid further problems in the future.
Yeah. So in addition, I think it's a good point to note that when you do have a situation where your account is compromised, you might not be the only person who's at risk. So if you have an account and there's data that you might have shared, for example, let's say you went on the site and you bought a gift and you decided to put a personal address for delivery to a third party, it's also worth just recognizing that sometimes you might want to reach out to those individuals and just say privately that something's happened to your account. Just be aware of strange requests or contact. And that's just being mindful that it's not just you, that you might be the only target in question. It's good. It's worth sort of checking. I think the most common example is when you look at social media, right? Where if your Insta account or your Facebook account has been hacked, and just like in Genie's case, right, when a friend of hers reached out to her under the guise of that sort of direct message, and it's really an indication that sometimes being aware that this is happening, you can sort of protect your loved ones as well.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Genie. So Genie, in case you, had something else to add, because there was some answers from Jeffrey, which actually answered some of the questions from the participants. So I thought in case you want to add anything on that in relation to impersonation and soliciting funds out and what are the recourse. So I think Jeffrey mentioned some of the tips and a scenario that he actually had from his client. And I guess, sort of like segue to that is, when it got hacked, on an online website or social media by foreign hackers, how to then, seek legal redress, sorry. Yeah, so we were wondering, I mean, if there is anything you'd like to add, Genie, on that front before we move on to the next scenario.
I think I'm good. We could move on in the interest of time.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to scenario 2, which is on nuisance calls. So this is also something that's really common that we always face, calls and messages that are sort of unsolicited marketing messages. You recognize them where it says you've won something, or, as what Genie mentioned about lucky draws sometimes, that you've, probably part of a promotional campaign, or like, there's some loans services, and sometimes you also get unsolicited online gambling text messages. So just because this is so common, I do wonder if Ginny and Jeffrey have any tips and tricks in regards to this very, I guess, a very commonplace and something that all of us face every day. Jeffrey, would you like to? Yeah.
So, so I think there was a lot of publicity some time ago when the PDPA was first passed about the do not call registry. That's your first, that's one of the first things you should do. Basically, if record your number with the do not call registry, the national DNC registry, and basically you can record your number to reflect that you should not be or you do not want to receive unsolicited phone calls, text messages, SMSs. And if you register your number with that registry, it helps you at least create a basis to say to the PDPC, if you were to file a complaint, that you, by receiving a text or you receiving a call, you actually, that organization potentially may have breached the PDPA. That gives the PDPC an opportunity to look into it. But of course, the thing about the DNC is putting your number on the registry is one thing, but you should also manage your consent so that it's clear which organizations can reach out to you, right, and engage you through this matter, because not all of these messages are going to be malicious. It's good to sort of start having some control over which organizations should reach you. The DNC, as a matter of legal provisions, there are exceptions, for example, where you do have ongoing relationships with organizations, they should contact you. So you have already consented perhaps under your arrangements with them, and getting a text or receiving something from them, that's not controversial. And reminding yourself that as a user or a consumer, you can actually have options in terms of whether to tell them to stop sending it and to withdraw your consent. Sometimes I have a service provider I've not dealt with for a while, and I suddenly get a message from them, and I realize, actually, no, I gave consent some time ago to that organization, and I have not yet withdrawn it. So I do send them an unsubscribe or a request to stop calling. So in other words, just taking control by looking at your options, one of them being to ensure that you put your number at the National DNC register. So that's just a legal first step to take.
Yeah, maybe just to add also, there are also other circumstances under which the DNC registry actually does not, the remit does not extend to those situations as well, especially when it comes to public messages that are sent by government agencies, of course, if they're legitimate and not the quote-unquote Ministry of Health kind of fake calls, right? And also political messages, which sometimes we experience when we come close to general elections. We sometimes receive those, also of course personal messages sent by individuals. Those are actually not covered by the DNC. So I think the scenario actually also touches on, have you been called by quote unquote the Ministry of Health about your lost parcel? Or SingPost for that matter. And I think this is not so much a nuisance call, if I read it right. It's more, I think it's a scam call, in which case I would recommend, and I do this myself, I would report the number, and by reporting scam in the Scam Shield app, so that the authorities can actually look at it and add the list to the number, to the growing list of numbers that should not actually harass you or be calling out from. There are limitations because, like I say, it's a growing list of contact numbers that are trying to call us and scam us. But unfortunately, we should all do our part. And so please try and use the Scam Shield app that's come out by the government and report scam as well.
Exactly a question about Scam Shield. So this exactly answers it on, how we can actually use Scam Shield. And also Jeffrey talked about DNC registry as well when it comes to nuisance calls. I think it's a good segue sort of to talk about the third scenario, and we also have some time, which is on job applications. So just a quick summary of this scenario, a practical scenario, is a young student who has just graduated from Polytechnic, and he's going to start work during his school holiday to make some money. He sees an advertisement online for a job as an admin assistant. He messages the recruiter on WhatsApp. The recruiter asks him to fill out a job application for his personal information, full name, email addresses, NRIC, etc. A week passes, no reply from this recruiter. John is extremely puzzled, since something went wrong or is really suspicious. He searches online. He found out that this recruitment agency, he can't find them online, and there's no such company that exists in Singapore. So I'm gonna sort of like turn to Jeffrey. I mean, he's the closest line of sight, but also, I mean, some of the practical things that, you know, organizations should also think about in this scenario, not just from a, you know, a prospective employee as well.
Yeah, this is a good scenario because it's actually a variant of very many forms of attack, and it's really if you think about it, it's a phishing scenario where they have masked or pretended to created a scenario where they sort of induce you to share information. So as a starting point, I think unfortunately we live in a world where we do need to be on guard, and we have to educate ourselves as to these type of potential risks. So in the case of John, I think if he had taken the effort to sort of build awareness to himself, he might have been a bit more, he might have realized as a starting point that when it comes to job applications, you really do need to do a bit of backgrounding. To, you know, if you're looking to be employed, it's actually worth finding out who your employer is and doing some checks before you actually take the step of sending your personal data over. And that in itself would be one of the things that should come to mind if you're going to part with something as valuable as your CV that contains a lot of biodata. And if you think about it, every interaction that you might have with a third party who's seeking the information from you, that radar should be up. And one of the places you can sort of go to actually to look at, just to be educated as a start, is Scam Alert SG. It's a lovely site. If you go there, you'll just give you perhaps some of the, they have, for example, the 5 main scam signs, right? They'll give you a listing as to tempting offers that they might give you. And a job application was perhaps a tempting offer in some cases. In other situations, the tempting offer might be, you know, that you've won a prize and you just need to go and collect it, or some other way to get, you know, something that you want to get. And it's really just inducing you to get involved. There's also scams which take the form of unexpected friend requests, and there's a variant of this, which is the love scams that you see, where these individuals are preyed on for their, you know, their desire for social connection. And then there are scams where you're asked to sort of put in payment information, and that is a big no-no, right? So if you're going to share your payment and credit details, that's always going to be a red flag of sorts. Most businesses have figured out that there are more secure ways that they could get you to legitimately transact with them, and just sending that information out isn't a good idea. Urgent money transfers, actually, there's a whole number of things that you can think about in terms of urgency, right? Someone will tell you that it's an emergency of some kind, and it's the pressure that's being put on you to share that data. So, you know, as much as we might anticipate there's a real problem going on, it's always worth having that sort of mental guard up. And then even OTP requests. So if someone calls you and says, look, I think you know, to assist you or facilitate your transaction, could you share your OTP? And you should never do that, right? Because the OTP is really, the one-time password is really the security credential that you rely on, often to facilitate something important like a credit transfer or money transfer. So it's just having that, being educated really is the key thing. And there are resources for you out there.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And I remember Genie talked a bit about, you know, the 2FA, the authentication as well. Wasn't sure if, Genie, you wanted to add in or chime in anything else that Jeffrey added in this.
Yes, I did say that, and I think I won't repeat that point. But when it comes to this particular scenario, look, this is actually, I believe a scenario out of a real life example, and actually there have been a lot of recent incidents along these lines. And I personally know of someone who actually was a victim to such a scam, actually. But some of the telltale signs would be that nobody actually would be asking, you for your NRIC number when you apply for a job. They shouldn't, yeah. And also, if you are applying for a job, usually for most of us, we would check very carefully the background of this company, and if it really doesn't exist, a very simple, due diligence by simply Googling or asking around would actually be able to provide you with the answers already. So I would just say that if you forget everything that's been shared, I would just really say that we need to be a little bit more discerning, and I think we owe it to ourselves to try and to do some due diligence before we just give away our personal information. A lot of times, and in some countries really, literally, and I'm not talking about Singapore, in some other countries around the world, if you were to go on the street and you hold a clipboard of some sorts and you actually ask the person, oh, can you show me your ID? I'm trying to complete a survey here. They would gladly take out the wallets and pass you the national IDs. I'm glad it doesn't quite happen in Singapore, but really I think being vigilant is the way to go. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeannie. So we spend a lot of time talking about, our day-to-day kind of personal encounters, and, Jeannie and Jeffrey have given really great examples, scenarios, real life cases. I think we have some time to talk about organizations and just pivot over to that. We also have actually one question related to organizations. So, one of the things that, the organizations care about is data breaches, right? Which as a result would worry and concern, the individuals whose data has been leaked. And we know that in recent cases in the news, there's been a lot of cyber attacks on many organizations of personal data, and people have suffered. One of the things that, we are very worried when they suffer the breaches is, how do the organizations themselves protect their data, and when data breaches happen, what can they do in these cases, right? Especially if we have people who have companies who join us today. So perhaps Jeannie, if you want to start off first and sort of giving some practical tips would be great.
Yeah. Thanks. As you were going through the scenario, it just crossed my mind, like how many times have we seen something, maybe a photocopy of somebody's personal information or ID at a photocopier machine in the office, right? So things like that still do happen, unfortunately. So I think it boils down to a fair amount of awareness and education within the organization as well. First of all, data protection should be embedded in each and every company's, every organization's corporate governance. And of course, secondly, your organization should develop appropriate data protection policies and practices and abide by them, right, as part of that corporate governance that I was talking about, and as well as your risk management structure. So these policies should be communicated clearly at every single level to all your employees and all external parties, such as your customers, your vendors even sometimes. And there has to be that top-down and bottom-up approach as well, where staff actually should practice personal data protection, and this can be done through implementation of certain internal policies. I used to work for an organization where the admin department executive would actually occasionally spot check by walking the office and seeing if there are actually documents which shouldn't be seen lying around in the office, but in fact are lying around in the office or the photocopy machine. And also some people like to pin the passwords on the clipboards, on the pin boards or the corkboards at their desk. And this is strictly no-no, and these things will actually be caught in such a spot check. And of course, regular briefings to employees and reminders are also very important. And of course, organizations should lead by example and put in place certain processes to operationalize some of these policies. to address data protection risks throughout the data lifecycle. And finally, organizations should regularly review their policies, their practices, and see the gaps, where people are actually not practicing what they ought to according to the policy. And I think all of these are some of the basic steps that I would share.
Jeannie, Jeffrey, maybe perhaps, we could answer a question from participants, because Jeannie's given really great solutions and examples. So one of the question is about nonprofit organizations as to whether they actually have a higher standard of obligation as it regards to data breaches. So, I wonder, because I know that there was a section that you mentioned about not-for-profit organizations, but maybe we can touch a little bit about that, given that we've got a couple minutes left.
I mean, as a matter of legal, as a matter of strict law, there isn't a separate category, I think, applicable to not-for-profit organizations. I think the categories where there might be enhanced or different or additional duties are where you are a not-for-profit organization that happens to be regulated by an additional regulator, right? I think the issue really then is recognizing that where there tends to be a differentiation for severity or greater enhanced sort of issues is when you are holding particularly sensitive data. Now, we don't actually in our law have a separate and specifically defined separate category sensitive data. And this can be data that's harvested, used by any organization for profit or not for profit. So to sort of lens that, we can think of ourselves not as being separated into NPOs and non-NPOs, but think about organizations which collect sensitive data and those that don't. And NPOs, if you're providing services to beneficiaries, if you're engaged in certain types of support for individuals, for example, you actually might be holding on to data that would, if in breach were involved, trigger a higher degree of severity of harm, right? If the data breach does occur. So in that sense, some NPOs would naturally be exposed to more severity of risk, and they should take more stringent measures to protect their data. In that sense, we do have a differentiation for some NPOs.
Thank you, Jeffrey. With that, we are sadly out of time. But the good news is that we've covered all the scenarios and answered all the questions from the participants. So that's really great. I'd like to invite our speakers to each give one key takeaway from today's session. Perhaps Jeannie, you want to go first, and then we'll have Jeffrey round up. Thank you.
One key takeaway is, and I think I've said this a lot throughout today's webinar, is to remain vigilant. Really, our personal information, financial data are actually extremely important. It can, and taking a leaf from what Jeffrey had said earlier on, it doesn't just stop at you. So it could be that your financial information was stolen, but other people within your close circles actually can also be affected. So then there can be that ripple effect. So please be extremely vigilant and do not take these things for granted, because a large part of why people do not care about these things so much still, unfortunately, is because they think that nobody's interested in my personal data, or it's not valuable. I don't have that much money in my bank. But really, it's not as simple as it looks. So please be vigilant and do not take anything for granted.
I guess what I would add is, I guess take that mindset. So, I started my presentation about showing you that sign about, more options and whatever, right? The key takeaway, I think, for all of us really as individuals is actually these choices that you make or don't bother making, they matter. So do treat your data more seriously. Do take an effort to be informed, understand the choices that you're making and the situations you might be putting yourself into, because it's not just protecting your own data, it's also protecting those that you love as well. And it's not just personal risk. Sometimes there are people who might not in turn depend on you to protect your data. So that's the key takeaway from me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Jeannie. we have to bring our Q&A session to a close, and this webinar, before we end, we actually have some links in the chats, which will be helpful for you in relation to some of these buzzwords that Jeffrey and Jeannie mentioned, things like PDPA, what's CMA, for example. At the end of this webinar, a survey form will also be popping up on your screen. We appreciate if you could help us to complete it and also to help us to improve our future webinars when you do such surveys. There'll be many more webinars and, you know, for the Law Awareness Weeks at CDC, continue to scan the QR code or visit our website to find out more about these other webinars. I would like to take this opportunity to really thank Jeffrey as well as Jeannie for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, practical examples. I'm pretty sure all of us are now experts on cybersecurity and the privacy legislations. With that, I also like to thank the audience for being very, very, you know, enthusiastic and asking us lots of questions, and for joining us tonight. Have a good week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.